here in the building. In the Transnational NGO Initiative, we regularly have visitors, either scholars or practitioners. And today we are together to welcome Dr. Derick Brinkerhoff of Research Triangle Institute. Before I go into his career, it's always funny for me how career paths intersect or cross. When I was in my master's degree at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, I already read Dr. Brinkerhoff's scholarly pieces on how to manage policy reform in the developing world, and it was one of the couple of pieces of literature that I still distinctly remember till this day, and made me interested in that whole area of policy reform and policy processes. In fact, when I started my first job at a think tank in the Netherlands, the European Center for Development Policy Management, you were one of the people who initially had sparked that interest in that. And then we met again in the mid-90s, we think, at the World Bank, when you were doing some presentations there, and I was working at the World Bank. And then we met you and your wife, Jennifer Brinkerhoff, who's at George Washington University, a very accomplished scholar there on diaspora communities and global policy. We've met several times, and now we have the honor of welcoming you today here, which is a real pleasure to me. So let me formally introduce you. Derick Brinkerhoff is a distinguished fellow at the Research Triangle Institute, which I'm supposed to have wrong. It's not Research Triangle International, but it's Institute, which is both a contract research organization, but also does some consulting, correct? Very large. What did you tell me last night? How many staff members? 2,600 staff members, divided over North Carolina, coming out of the three universities there, Duke, North Carolina Public, and the University of North Carolina. But also has a large Washington office, which is where you are based. So you're currently that distinguished fellow in international public management. Derick has more than 25 years of experience with public management issues. I've already mentioned the whole issue of managing policy reform processes, but also his specialization is in program implementation as well as evaluation, participation, civil society, institutional development, and democratic governance, which we will talk primarily about today. He is the North American editor of the UK-based journal Public Administration and Development. He also holds an associate's faculty appointment at George Washington University at the School of Public Policy and Public Administration. And to me, one of the interesting things about Derick's career is that he's been able to kind of cover or bridge both scholarly work and somewhat more applied work, some consulting, a little bit of training here and there, I think. And to me, that makes for a really interesting mix of competencies. He also co-authored a book that will be a little bit of focus this afternoon at 3 o'clock. We'll do a separate career session, an informal career session with interested students who want to pursue a career that is of the interesting mix of competencies that Derick has. And he'll be discussing, amongst others, his book, Working for Change, Making a Career in International Public Service, which I bought not long ago at a conference, amongst others, because there are two leaders are highlighted in here who I have had the honor of working with over the years. So we'll talk about that at 3 o'clock, and that's in 341 Eggers, by the way. So today, Derick is going to talk about a program that he's done long-standing work on, both research and in-country, civil society capacity development, and lessons from the democratic reform support program in Indonesia. And I'll just finish by saying is one of the things when we presented this, part of this at an earlier conference, what really stuck with me is how he talks about the extent to which domestic Indonesian NGOs are rooted in their own society. So I'm hoping to learn more about that. I think that's a very important issue, and also constraint in many domestic NGOs. So you have the floor.
Thanks, Tosca. So as Tosca said, I'm going to be talking about one of the programs that RTI has implemented in Indonesia, the Democratic Reform Support Program, or DRSP, that ran from 2005 to 2010. RTI has been active in Indonesia for over 30 years, and we have an ongoing string of projects up to the present day. This is one that I was involved in, both the startup and some of the capacity development work with the local NGOs that we worked with. So here are the things that I'm going to be talking about today. First, since we're talking about capacity development for NGOs, I'm going to start and say a little bit about what do we mean by that, and then talk a bit about democracy support programs and capacity development in that context, and then some of the lessons that have come out of our experience with DRSP in Indonesia. Capacity development, like a lot of terms in the international development field, have varying interpretations and a lot of fuzziness around them. And this is out of a piece that I did actually that was part of a study when I was working with ECDPL, where we were looking at capacity development issues. And these are kind of the big categories that I've seen when we're thinking about capacity, that a lot of times at the most basic level, people equate that with do you have the resources to do what you want to do or not? And so at that most fundamental level, the way to build capacity is to give people money, staff, vehicles, buildings, those kinds of things. And that has the nice feature of being pretty concrete. You can look at that. But then it gets kind of difficult when you draw the line between having the resources and doing other things. The other area that I think is probably the most common one when people talk about capacity building, they're talking about skills and knowledge. So a lot of capacity building is defined in terms of workshops, training courses, seminars, those kinds of things. But capacity also has to do with how you're organized to carry out whatever it is you want to do, and it also relates to the broader political and power environments and incentives. So in the model that I'm going to talk about in terms of capacity development for Indonesian NGOs, we'll see all of these things kind of arrayed in a model. So democracy promotion has been something that donors have been interested, particularly bilateral ones. USAID has had a long history of programs in this area, as has DIPA. Those are probably the two strongest bilateral donors supporting democracy, as well as some foundations. There's been a key focus on strengthening civil society and NGO members of civil society. So a lot of focus on looking at organizational capacity building, the kind of skills and training I was talking about. Some focus on the enabling environment, recognizing the role of incentives and policy. A lot of focus on building partnerships and coalitions, so not just individual NGOs, but networks. And often the way that this is organized is in terms of giving NGOs and civil society groups grants. And the DRSP program that we were implementing was USAID funded, and it had all of these pieces in it. The way that it was structured to provide money to the local CSOs was through a series of grants, but it wasn't just a straight cash transfer. They came with what the NGOs perceived as strings attached, which had to do with capacity building and some training. And one of the things that we started out with was essentially doing a policy scan of the kind of issues that local NGOs were interested in, and deciding which of those were areas that DRSP was to support. So this is kind of the basic model of taking those capacity factors in that table and structuring them a little bit into a set of external and internal factors that influence the capacity of civil society organizations and NGOs. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these in the Indonesian context with the organizations that we were working with. Many of you probably know that Indonesia is one of the countries that is often held up as a model of a successful democratic transition. For today's news, I've seen some of the comparisons to Egypt, saying, positing Indonesia as one of the potential paths, along with the scary one for U.S. and Iran. So this is Indonesia is often held up as a model of a good way to make the transition from a long period of authoritarian rule to an open system. And I think certainly one of the points to remember here is that it's not a one point in time event. It's a long transition, and that's certainly something that comes up in thinking about the role of NGOs and civil society organizations and their interactions with the government around reform. So it's interesting to note that in Indonesia, it's not that NGOs didn't exist before the transition. There are actually a lot of them. Quite a vibrant civil society, very much restricted under Suharto and all to non-political roles. So it wasn't that the government was hostile to NGOs as long as they were providing services and mobilizing villages to do good things related to village development. That was fine, as long as you did not put your foot into political waters. So certainly one of the changes that took place when the Suharto regime collapsed was an opening up of a new space for civil society that had to do with politics, advocacy, and democracy promotion. So this is, I think, one of the features of the governance environment was essentially a relatively repressive political regime suddenly falling by the wayside as a result of the combination of the economic downturn, the student uprisings, and then labor and other social groups joining in with the students to cause Suharto to step down, and then a series of transitional governments. So that certainly opened up space, but it also meant that and I think, again, thinking about how this resonates with what's going on in Egypt today and some of the points that we've seen is just because you've got a transition, particularly in terms of public administration, all those people don't go away. They're still there, along with a lot of the attitudes, practices, procedures, and laws. So one of the things that has been an important feature of trying to figure out how civil society organizations can interact is where there are people in government who are open to having civil society input. And one of the legacies of the transition period is that government tended to see civil society as an oppositional force that was interested mostly in demonstrating and criticizing rather than working with them. So in some of the stories I'm going to tell you, it's this transition from being an opponent to being a partner, and the difficulties on both sides of the fence of doing that. Societal norms and values, as I said, there's been a long history in Indonesia of societal action outside of government, non-political, until more recently. And also an emphasis on, because Indonesia is a Muslim society, an emphasis on Muslim charity, so there is a tradition of giving. The interesting thing for these democracy promotion NGOs is what they provide is difficult to describe. And so in some of the workshops that we had with the leaders of these organizations, we talked about how were they going to transition off of donor funding to some kind of funding base in the country. And they were lamenting that most people who think of tithing or the Muslim term is zakat, where you're supposed to give a certain percentage of your income for good works, that doesn't translate into advocacy for legal change, empowerment for citizens. It's more around individual services for needy people and all. So that's an interesting feature of the environment there. legal and administrative structures. One of the things that's been going on in Indonesia since the collapse of the Suharto regime has been